All right, Shame listeners, mark your calendars. The 17th annual Milwaukee Film Festival is set for April 24th through May 8th, 2025. Get ready for an incredible lineup of films, from thought-provoking features to compelling short films across a variety of programs, including Worldviews, North American Independence, Genre Queer, Black Lens, Sound Vision, Cine Sin Fronteras, Rated K for Kids, and the always bold Cinema Hooligante. Hosted at Milwaukee Film's historic Oriental and Downer theaters, the festival promises an unforgettable cinematic experience. Tickets and passes are now on sale with special discounts for Milwaukee Film members. For all the details, visit www.mkefilm.org/MFF. Once again, that website is www.mkefilm.org/MFF. Be sure to check them out.
Warning! This movie podcast actually discusses movies. Be aware that it may discuss any of the following elements: endings, surprise twists, unexpected cameos, and all manner of spoilers. If this doesn't appeal to you, then why listen to a movie podcast? Without further ado, please enjoy our feature presentation, The Shameless Picture Show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Shameless Picture Show. My name is Michael Viers and I am your host. And this week I am being joined by a very special guest, David Gregory. David Gregory, for those of you who are not familiar, is a filmmaker and co-founder of Severin Films, a company dedicated to restoring and distributing cult, horror, and exploitation cinema with high-quality releases and in-depth bonus features. He has directed acclaimed documentaries such as Lost Soul, The Doomed Journey of Richard Stanley's Island of Dr. Moreau, and Blood and Flesh, The Real Life and Ghastly Death of Al Adamson. Through Severin, Gregory has helped preserve and celebrate genre films, building a reputation as a leader in cult film restoration and appreciation. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
So like I said, I'm really happy to have you on. I've been a fan of Severin Films for quite a long while now at this point. I actually remember what my first release was. It was Richard Stanley's Hardware, actually.
Yep.
Once upon a time, I was an editor for Troma. And at one point, Lloyd sent me an interview that he did with Richard Stanley. And as you probably know, because you've spent a lot of time talking to him, he can tell a story like no
Yes.
other. And without seeing a single frame of Hardware, I knew I had to see that movie. Just the way that he talked about it. And I happened to Google Hardware Blu-ray, and you guys were the first thing that came up before it went out of print.
It's funny that's how you found out about us, because when we got Hardware, when we first did the deal, I was actually in Sundance attending the Troma Dance Festival where my film Plague Town was showing. And I just remember very specifically where Carl and I were staying, getting the call from Jay Douglas from Rykodis saying, hey, Hardware is available. A lot of the work's already been done by Subversive Cinema, who put out Dust Devil, but they were out of business. So basically, rather than let that deal go away, they sent it over to us.
Oh, that's really funny. So it was just one that, like, you didn't have to do any restoration work or anything on it?
No, all that work was already done. It was
Okay.
Subversive Cinema actually did that work. I mean, we created a bunch of the new extras, but they had gone to the trouble of doing that while they'd spent a long time doing it. And but by the time that it was finished, they were out of business.
Oh wow, wow, wow. So and then if from there, so you released hardware,
Mhm.
and then a little bit of time later, you did the documentary Lost Soul. How did that come to be?
Well, we actually did Theatre Bizarre in between,
Mm.
which was an anthology film we made with 7 directors, and one of the directors was Richard. And so I actually went to visit him in Montpellier, which was not far from where he was living in France. And we did the deal to do Theatre Bizarre, and then he came on board for that. And then we spent a lot of time promoting Theatre Bizarre, and then I would go and visit him in Montsegur, the town where he was living back then. And at one point, I was just like, "So I've heard so many rumors. What happens with the island of Dr. Moreau?" And he started telling me, I think over dinner when he first started telling me, and I was like, okay, let's stop this right now. I really should be rolling camera on this, because this is obviously, you have a lot to say. And as you know, as somebody who's heard Richard Stanley interviews, the guy can definitely tell a story and has a lot to say, on something which he is interested in. And so we did. I think the following day, I just happened to have my camera with me, and I just put it on the shelf behind me. Didn't even have a tripod. And that's the interview that you see in Lost Soul. So I basically, it was a long interview with Richard telling his whole story beginning to end. And as it was going, I was like, okay, this is not just some blog post to promote Theatre Bizarre. This needs to be its own film. So when I got back, that's when I started contacting other people to tell their side of the events.
And it's such a fascinating story too. And like you said, Richard he could tell you what he had for breakfast and make it compelling.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to hear him talk about that story and to hear the stories about him sneaking back on set and um it's been a couple years since I've watched it, but just all the way he tells the story of what happened there, it feels larger than life in a way that stories about making cinema doesn't feel like anymore.
Yeah, I
And
mean, it's definitely one of the more unique, disastrous production stories. I mean, I think documentaries about disastrous productions, there are other examples of them. There's the Apocalypse Now one, for
mhm,
example, and obviously that came out with a great film at the end of it, but the production itself was a disaster,
yeah.
and with one thing after another. The Terry Gilliam one about the Lost in La Mancha is another, and Werner Herzog's one about Fitzcarraldo again, which they eventually made a great film, but the actual getting to that point was quite something. And so when you find one of those with so many kind of unique elements, that it's really something that's fun to tell. I mean, there are others like the Super Mario Brothers movie, the first one,
Mhm.
was another disastrous production, but it wasn't. But we did the extra for Second Sight Films, and it wasn't quite enough for it to be, it wasn't wild enough and unbelievable enough for it to be its own film, even though it made a great extra, and we're doing one right now on Zulu Dawn, which again it doesn't get as wild as the Island of Dr. Moreau, and so it will be an extra on the 4K of Zulu Dawn. But that also was an extremely troubled film with all kinds of problems going on while it was being made. And those things are fascinating, because to mount a movie just takes so much, and just once things start to unravel and start going wrong, it can just snowball out of control. And then of course you have the added element of Richard and his kind of unique way of doing things and seeing the world, and that really kind of to kind of lead the story, that really made it into something.
Oh, absolutely. So if you don't mind me asking, so you have made at this point a lot of some of them became behind the scenes featurettes, some of them became their own individual documentary. I think most recently it was the Clones of Bruce Lee. I think that was your most recent one.
No,
Um
actually, the Susanna, the Queen of Black Magic, was the most recent
okay, my
feature.
my
Yeah.
mistake.
Okay.
Enter the Clones of Bruce Lee was the most recent one that I saw. So
Mhm.
clarification. when you set out to make one of these, do you know from the start if it's going to be a featurette or if it's going to be its own standalone film, or do you find that within the process?
I think in the case of Susanna, we actually started it out as a feature, but all of the others have started out as extras, including the ones I produced, like Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, the folk horror documentary. Started out as an extra, and then basically it just becomes something more as you're doing the interviews, and sometimes it's just the first interview that inspires that. In the case of Lost Soul, it was the interview with Richard. In the case of Blood and Flesh, the Al Adamson story, it was the first interview was with David Conow, who did the book on Al Adamson, and it was like, this is definitely, there's more to this than just the average making of story. I mean, that one involved true crime as well, so that was interesting to me to go into sort of another avenue other than just kind of the antics of making low budget movies. And Enter the Clones Bruce, same thing. I did an interview with Michael Worth, who was kind of the expert on Bruceploitation, and that one was slightly different in that I wasn't sitting thinking, oh, this is a story I can tell. It was more like, what happened to these guys? What do they think about being Bruce Lee clones? I've never seen an interview with Bruce Lee, certainly not an English friendly interview with Bruce Lee. And so so that one was what was more of a voyage of discovery, where there was very little information that we could get from already published material. So that was where we had to track the people down and then ask them about it, and so that one was kind of the most difficult one to put together in post-production, because I didn't actually know the structure as I was going in.
So you had to find the story as you went. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And so for me, so I've been a physical media collector pretty much my entire life. When I was a kid, VHS was popular, and then I remember when DVD came out, and that was the first time I ever got to see a behind the scenes featurette. And great, it was probably just like a no frills like EPK or something like that, where it's just, oh yeah, we're having a great time shooting this movie. But it let me into the process of filmmaking, and that is actually what directly led me to wanting to be a filmmaker. So as I got more into physical media, and then as I started discovering more boutique labels, I want to say Blue Underground might have been the first one that I discovered. Getting to see these behind the scenes featurettes or these interviews was always fascinating for me, and I can see that you have made a lot of them yourself. And I was talking to Matt Harding recently. He was on one of the episodes of this show, and we were talking specifically about Al Adamson. And so we talked about your documentary, and then we also talked about the Severin release of Dracula versus Frankenstein. And I was saying to him that we are in a very interesting time period for these interviews and these featurettes, because in some ways these are the only living documents of what happened on those sets, what happened making those films. Al Adamson is more of a name now than he was for a while, but people aren't writing books about him the way that they are with John Ford. So your documentary, for example, or the interviews on the discs that you put out, are the only way that we can know what happened on those sets. And I think that's where physical media is really going, is it's a living document in that way. And I know at the same time that a lot of people out there, they just want to see the movie, and that's great. But I also love that these things exist.
Yep.
And how did you, I know you had you were doing I think you had a label before Severin, but how did you get started making these things? Was it you just needed someone to shoot an interview and you got started doing it? I'm curious how that started.
I basically was also very interested in behind the scenes stuff. So documentaries were limited to things like Star Wars and Superman and and that sort of thing. They were like kind of showing off the special effects of big budget movies. That's really all you could see. But I was fascinated by it, being somebody who was just madly into films. It was fascinating to see that kind of thing. But because I was a horror fan and a fan of all kinds of horror, but most of it low budget, it was frustrating that there was very little of this documentary making of evidence of this kind of thing. I think Roy Frumke's Document of the Dead was a rare example. Texas
Hmm.
Chainsaw Massacre, The Family Portrait was another, where you actually had, rather than having just interviews in magazines, you had people actually talking to camera about the making of films. And so that's kind of what led me to wanting to interview people back when I had a VHS label in the 90s. In the late 90s, we had one in England called Exploited. And I actually interviewed Alan Ormsby so that he could be an extra at the end of the movie. Was an interview with Alan Ormsby on Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things and Death Dream. And then interviews with Harry Novak and other people we were able to just get interviews with to put at the end of the film. But I ended up doing Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Shocking Truth was the first kind of long form one that I did, because Texas Chainsaw Massacre was just becoming legal for the first time on home video in the UK in the late 90s. Very end of the 20th century, it was finally legally coming out on video. And it was my favorite film, and Gunnar Hansen came to the UK, and I interviewed him there on camera, and then I started talking to him about like who else is still around, because I wanted to hear their stories. I mean, we'd heard from Toby Hooper, we'd heard from a couple of the key people from Texas Chainsaw, including the people who were in Family Portrait. There was a lot of people involved in the making of that movie that made it what it was, and it was kind of shrouded in mystery
Hmm.
because there was so little documentary evidence. Anyway, he put me in touch with loads of people. I went to Austin and LA and interviewed as many people as possible that I could get, and that was one of those ones where the behind the scenes story was unlike any other movie. It had stuff like the fact that all the lightning striking of all these talented, hungry people got together, the right people got together to make this film at the right time, in the blazing hot summer of Texas to make this, one of the greatest films ever made. But then all the stuff that went on with them getting mob distribution and all that kind of stuff, it was a bit of a gift, really, to make that into a making of. And it was basically then that I met Bill Lustig, who was producing discs for Anchor Bay Entertainment, and he asked me to make a documentary on The Wicker Man, which also had a fascinating behind the scenes story. And so that was the first one that I did specifically as a DVD extra. And he liked the way that was coming on. Anchor Bay was exploding at that point in the DVD market. They were basically, they were kind of the first to really kind of make these kinds of horror movies that we do now. The Italian horror, the European horror
Hmm.
movies, and all that kind of thing had not really been available in the US in any kind of decent uncut form before. And so it was a massive gap in the market that Anchor Bay was able to fill. And they needed extras, so I became the kind of main guy for Bill and Anchor Bay, and it was great. I just got to look through the future release schedule and say, okay, we can do that, we can do that, we can do that, and doing commentaries and featurettes and single interviews and traveling around and meeting all these filmmakers, and it was a bit of a dream. And then I moved with Bill to Blue Underground when he first started Blue Underground, and I was with him for the first 5 years before we started Severin.
And actually, you've when you were working with Bill Lustig, you made one of my favorite behind the scenes documentaries, the Joe Spinell story.
Yeah, that was when Maniac came out through Anchor Bay, and so Bill was greenlighting most of the extras, along with Jay Douglas, who was kind of worked for Anchor Bay. Bill was an independent contractor who basically worked did the production for Anchor Bay. And he would greenlight pretty much anything that I suggested, for the extras at that point, because the business was so good. But with Maniac and the Joe Spinell story, he didn't want to do a making of Maniac. He was like, we've got the commentary, that's got all the key people on it. We should do something, a tribute to Joe, is how he put it. And so I just started trying to find people who'd worked with Joe Spinell, which were many, because of course he'd had such a varied career, mainly in bit parts and character roles. But that's kind of how that became, like a bio documentary rather than a making of. And again, it was Bill who really gave me just real free reign, because of course it was going to accompany Maniac, his movie, so he wanted it to be as thorough as possible. And that definitely was a real kind of landmark featurette as far as the work that I've done goes.
Yeah, like I said, that one always really stuck with me. And there was a period of time when Blue Underground was releasing different versions of Maniac, and the version that I bought at one point didn't have it on there, and I just kept buying copies of Maniac until I could get that one. Because I think at one point, I think I had it was on YouTube or something, but and it was like, well, one, I want to support the disc. I don't want to watch it on YouTube. But it's like I want a copy of it, and so that was important to me. And so even before I started kind of following your career with Severin and then the documentaries you're making, like, I had realized that I had seen your work before then. Like I said, the Joe Spinell story, I've seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Shocking Truth. So it was almost like once I discovered Severin and I saw your name attached to it, I was like, oh, that name sounds familiar, and I looked it up, and looking back and all the things you had made, it was kind of interesting to see that so much of where my taste started to develop as a horror fan was because of some of the stuff that you were making. It kind of opened up new doors. Like, I had seen an Al Adamson film before I saw your documentary, but your documentary recontextualized his work in a way that made me, when I went back to rewatch some of this stuff, I enjoyed it on a completely different level.
Yeah, well, I mean, in that one in particular, and I guess you could say the same with quite a lot of the featurettes that I did over the years. It's very easy for people to be like, oh, that's just a bad film or a bad filmmaker. And what interests me so much about making low budget films in the trenches of low budget, working in the trenches of low budget filmmaking, is it's difficult to make a film no matter what level you're working at. So basically you do everything you can with the means that you have to actually get something that is releasable. And with Al in particular, I thought it was important to point out that he was working with particularly low budgets, not just Hollywood low budgets, like really low budgets. And so he was more of a guy who was able to sort of put all the elements together and make something out of it, like have an old movie star in there, which was also Sam Sherman, his producer, was a big old movie fan. So he would kind of force him to put people, the old movie stars, in certain things. But, to have those guys, and then like young people like Bud Cardos and Gary Kent, who could act and do stunts and fly a plane and get and had a place out in the desert, and could do production coordinating and all that. So putting all those elements together and finding somebody like Marilyn Joy, who would come along for the ride. She wasn't afraid of nudity. She was also a good actress. She also had a great screen presence. Putting all those elements together is a skill. And it is, and to actually come out at the end of it with just something that's entertaining and releasable, that's quite something.
No, absolutely.
So even on the stuff that what makes it funny is that they would often go back when they failed to actually get to the finish line with something that would be commercial. They would actually go back in and add to it and completely change the movie by filming new footage and repackage it and re-release it. That's kind of the more kind of hustle side of things. also exciting.
No, absolutely. And I'm very much in the same in the same boat as you in that way. It's a minor miracle the fact that anything ever gets made for any budget. And when you see that everything that someone like an Al Adamson does with so little, or like a Nick Millard or a Ted V. Michaels or something like that, they they don't have much money. They just kind of will it into existence,
Yeah.
and that's inspiring.
Yeah.
Um,
And in the case of Al, it wasn't like a love of genre movies either, whereas somebody like Ted V. Mickles, it is, and he wants to make that kind of movie. With Al, he's just thinking sort of commercially. So he was definitely he was more about the business of it, but it's still, took something to it. Again, like the cinematographers he got, Gary Graver for the most part, and later in his career was an absolute godsend to people who worked at that. Fred Olen Ray used him a lot as well, but so did Orson Welles. I mean, this is a guy who had his own kit, knew how to shoot a movie, and loved making it, so he wouldn't like complain if it was going to go over hours or something like that. So and he could bring his crew with him, like a bunch of young people who went on to great things. I mean, all those things are what you need in order to put together a good exploitation movie, and that's way more interesting to me than the making of a Hollywood movie, because or even a well budgeted independent movie, because it really the kind of what can we do in order to get this to the finish line factor and particularly if they come out with something that people are still watching 20, 30, 40 years later. That's amazing, really.
So I want to go back a little bit and ask you about some of your earliest film memories. And the reason I'm curious by that, because you've spent pretty much your entire life dedicated to the world of film and film culture. So what point did you fall in love with it? What was that moment that you realized that this is something that you're really into?
It was when my parents took me to see King Kong, the 1976 version, at the movie theater. So that would have been probably was when I was like 4. Was when that was released theatrically. So that made a huge impression on me. And then I saw the original on TV not long after that. So then I just became obsessed with dinosaurs and Dracula and monsters and that kind of thing. So anything at that point that I could see that was genre related, there was nothing else that I was obsessed with. And no interest in sport or anything like that. Like I could have a peripheral interest in stuff like that, or cars or anything like that, but movies, and in particular horror movies, were what I was after. And of course, it was quite, as a kid, it's not as easy. Certainly in England, it wasn't as easy to see these things. So anything that was remotely horror or horror adjacent, I was into. So there was various TV series in England that were important. House of Horror was a big one, and whenever the BBC would show Hammer Films or Universal Films or anything, then I would stay up late with the babysitter and watch them, and all that kind of thing. And then video came in, so we were quite early getting a VCR in our house. So that's when the floodgates really opened to the fact that and when I also had, like a lot of people of my age group in England, we had the Dennis Gifford horror movies book, we had the William K. Everson classics of the horror movie, we had Ed Nahar's Horrors from Scream to Scream, we had magazines like the House of Hammer. So all these things also really contributed to it, because I actually knew about these films, a lot of these films, like what years they were, who was in them, all that kind of thing. You obsess over these books, and you can't actually, there's no way to actually see the film before the video era. So you had to kind of conjure it up in your mind. So then I was making Super 8 films with friends and all that kind of the usual stuff.
And you touched on something that I didn't quite have, but I had to an extent, when you were saying that with these books, these reference materials, you didn't have a way to see a lot of those films because video wasn't around for a while. And when I was a kid, video was around, but it was still hard to find some of that stuff, some of the smaller stuff, because I was the same way. I would anything that I could find that was like a reference guide about movies. Like Leonard Maltin was one of the first people that I remember like really getting into, because you could he would give you a description of the film and tell you whether or not he liked it in like 4 sentences. It was quite impressive. And I remember reading those books page to page and just committing things to memory, so that way if I ever did walk around the video store, I could try to look for some of this stuff. And horror for me as well was a fascination. I was deathly afraid of it, but I was fascinated by it. So the video store that I grew up with was a small little mom and pop video store called Bucky's Super Video here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And every year for Halloween, they would decorate up their horror section with like little things that would jump out at you, and I was petrified to walk down it, because even just the covers would give me nightmares, but I couldn't help myself. I was fascinated by it. And when I think about my own life as a cinephile, filmmaker, whatever I want to refer to myself as, that seems to be in a lot of ways the drug that I'm chasing, is those feelings that I got when I was a kid.
Yeah, same. And but basically horror movies never scared me, and basically it was more an obsession with them. And so an obsession with the pictures in the books. I wanted to do the makeup. I wanted to create the monsters. It was the monsters that I was fascinated by. The film that scared me the most as a kid was The Poseidon Adventure, weirdly, because that was about a boat that tipped over, and most of the people on that boat die. And so, when we used to go on holiday from England to France, we would take a ferry, and I just from then on, I was just terrified that that's what was going to happen on the family holiday. And so, it would scare me so much that I would have to think about Dracula and Frankenstein and stuff in order to take my mind off the Poseidon Adventure and go to sleep with sweet dreams. So it was basically one of those weird things, because it brought it all into reality. Whereas the horror stuff, I was just determined to be involved in making them, right from a very young age. And even though at school it was definitely discouraged, and so my obsession was definitely considered not healthy when I was in school. So basically, so I had to kind of defy that. Like, I had friends who were into it, but their parents managed to wean them off it, but my parents never did.
So did you have a goal in mind of like, did you want to work in movies, or what was your dream as a young child obsessed with horror films?
Yeah, it was definitely to make horror movies. It was basically one of the things that I was always that I always argued with the parents and teachers and things like that, was that I was very clear right from early on that I know the difference between a film and reality, which is always the fear that your kid's mind is getting warped and they'll become violent because of what they're seeing. And I was right from a very early age. I was like, I can very much tell the difference between this and real violence. Like, real violence is definitely off-putting, and you see it on the news. It's not enjoyable. Whereas in a movie, very enjoyable. The more violence, the better. The bloodier, the better. And that was kind of, and same with the movies that I would make in Super 8. I mean, we were definitely modeling them after Video Nasties and Bloody Moon and Driller Killer and things like that, because we tried to get as much blood and as many tools from the garage involved in the Super 8 movies that we made. And so when I started making those, I was probably 8 years old or so, and I would always be writing scripts and things like that. So it was definitely about making films. So even though I pretended to the school careers officer that I was interested in some normal job, it was always just a smoke screen. It was like I need to get through this week of school just by pretending that, and then we can make another film or rent another movie this weekend.
So what led you to, I know you said you had a VHS company before you worked with Bill Lustig and before Severin. How did you get into that? How did you get into releasing films?
Well, it started with the collecting of the movies that were banned in England, because all of this stuff behind me was available until 1985, and then between 1983 and 1985, it all started getting banned. Basically, they introduced a new law where every film had to have a rating for home video, whereas it didn't have that before. And so Carl, who started Severin with me, we were at school together, and we would go around to video shops and find out if they had any of the old tapes that they had to take off the shelves in the back for sale. We started our collections that way. But we also started communicating with other people up and down the country who, from a fanzine called Sam Hain, had like a collector's corner where people would say, looking for horror movies, send me your wants list and I'll send you mine. You had to be careful because it was illegal. That was considered distribution, and you could actually be arrested for that. So you had to be careful what you actually wrote in these, and you had to watch out for people who looked like they were not real horror fans who were trying to communicate with you and trick you and then bust you. Because I never got busted, but some of the people did actually get busted and taken away and have their collection seized because of distribution, because they taped a film. So basically, that's how we would get the stuff that was banned. Either we would get it from video shops or from other collectors. So there was quite a healthy bootleg business going on then, because, I have a copy of I Spit on Your Grave. You can no longer get it officially, so you would tape it and buy it off somebody else or trade it with somebody else. And so Carl and I were doing that, and we actually started selling some films that way as well. That's how, if somebody wants something you want, you can get it, something they have that you want. But one of those days, it led me to a distributor in Nottingham called VPN. And I didn't know there was a video distribution company in Nottingham. There was nothing film related in Nottingham at all. All seemed to be like London stuff, like way away from where I grew up. But it was a budget video distribution company. I went to him to basically ask if he had any illegal tapes, which he didn't. But he was very interested in my interest and my obsession with movies. So he offered me a job, for a summer job while I was in school. And basically that's when I started working in distribution. At first, I was just kind of packing boxes and to be shipped around the country. But then I eventually got on the phones and selling tapes to HMV and other stores up and down the country. And then that's how I kind of learned about rights. Like he had masters that he would duplicate, but at that point, not many. After the Video Recordings Act came in, there were many masters hanging around. So a lot of the low budget people would just duplicate the shit out of these tapes, even if the rights had expired, and they changed the titles and put them out. And that was kind of when I realized the difference between, just getting something out for the bargain bin and actually buying the rights from somebody. So that's kind of how I found out about that.
So rights is something I've always been really fascinated about. Because companies like Severin or some of the other companies out there like Vinegar Syndrome or whatnot, you guys are releasing things that sometimes have never had an official release. How do you go about tracking down the rights for some of these films?
It varies. I mean, a lot of time is spent doing the detective work to find out who the current owner of a certain film is. And if it's an independent, as was the case with a lot of these films, then you have to find the heir of find out if the producer's still around. In a lot of cases, they're not. Then you have to find out who their assets went to. In other cases, like there's a lot. We release a lot of Italian films. We release more Italian films than any other.
Yeah,
we've probably released more Italian films than any company in American distribution history.
probably.
But fortunately, in Italy, the majority of films are owned by about 5 different companies that are still in business because they still have the family business. So that makes it easy to actually track down the rights, and they usually have the negatives as well in that situation. Similar situation in Spain. It really varies. Like if a film hasn't been out though, that people are like, oh, why haven't you released this? It's usually because there's either a dispute between two parties that own the film, or it's owned by a studio. Like a lot of things go back and ended up in MGM's library for some reason, so we'll probably never see the light of day.
Has there been, off the top of your head, a title from the Severin archive that was harder to secure the rights than something else? Like, was there one that you can think of that was way more difficult than you were anticipating it to be?
I mean, the Russ Meyer films were very difficult to actually get to the point where we could release them, although we knew all along who owned them, but it was a matter of coming to a deal with them where they actually were happy with that deal, but also trusted us to take care of the films in the manner that they wanted them taken care of. So that was difficult. But there are others like Santa Sangre, for example, which we've had for years now, and we own it perpetuity and worldwide now, but it was not out for quite some time, and so we just had to keep on waiting till the original license expired, because the original company that owned it, I think they went out of business, and then it went to MGM, and MGM didn't care about it. So when the rights reverted back to Claudio Argento, then we were able to license it. But we were one of many companies that tried to get the rights to that before we actually secured it.
Okay. So you when you were releasing VHS, you told me you would later go on to work with William Lustig over at Anchor Bay and then Blue Underground. Where did the idea for Severin come from? What made you want to start your own company?
Well, Bill was kind of slowing down.
Mm-hmm.
He saw the writing on the wall, because the DVD business was not what it once was.
Mm-hmm.
When Anchor Bay was flying high, and at the beginning of Blue Underground, there was films were selling a lot more units than they are now.
Yeah.
And also the playing field got very busy at that point. There were a lot of labels springing up. There were a lot of boutique labels springing up at that time, all kind of vying for the same stuff. But John, Cregan, Carl, and myself, who started Severin, we knew that Bill was going to be downsizing, so we knew we had to do something in order to make sure that we were still working. Basically, after he decided to he never did close the doors, but he threatened it quite a few times, particularly when he had like many employees. It was a lot of overhead. So there was a couple of films that John and I had tried to get Bill to pick up, but he wasn't interested. And it was the two of them being Gwendolyn and Felicity, which turned out to be Severin's first two releases. Bill had no interest in these films. Now, one of the things that most of the other boutiques at the time were not doing was erotic films. And so we were like, okay, if we're going to start a label, we should probably follow that niche, because nobody else is specializing in erotic films. Most of them dabbled in erotic films, Synapse, Subversive, Blue Underground, No Shame, all of those guys did some, but they wanted to primarily concentrate on horror and not be associated with that. We didn't have those kind of scruples, particularly as we knew that those films actually always did well, for all of us. Like the stuff that Salon Kitty and Emmanuel in America, for example, for Blue Underground, were huge hits. And I try to think of some examples for Anchor Bay, like Immoral Tales, for example, for Anchor Bay was a huge hit and an evergreen, and would keep on selling. So we were like, we should get some movies like that. There's no end of them, and people aren't following these films. So we did. So we got Gwendolyn and Felicity first, and a couple of Jess Franco's 80s erotic films, then the Black Emmanuel films. So we started out just with kind of that soft erotic stuff, and all of it did really well out of the gate. I don't know if we would have survived had we not released Gwendolyn and Felicity first, because they were very popular right out of the gate.
So were you a fan of the erotic films, or were you more?
I mean, I not particularly. I mean, I appreciated them. I certainly, from a historical perspective, Emmanuel and all that it spawned is absolutely fascinating. And I still find that fascinating. But no, I wasn't necessarily. They weren't necessarily the ones that I watched. John actually was more into that particular subgenre because he'd grown up with Skinemax. So basically, seeing films on Skinemax, made a big impression on teenage lads over here. So basically, it was, but I also did like the Joe D'Amato. I love Joe D'Amato because of just how he basically trolls his audience, and that I don't know that anybody finds all of Emmanuel America erotic. I mean, if they do, it would be an interesting conversation to have with them about about what's erotic about this particular scene. And Joe D'Amato just used to kind of have fun with it. So I really liked the fact that he was doing something very different and really, really going after the exploitation element.
Yeah, and I've kind of had the same relationship with erotic films or even some of the pornographic films. Like, I find them fascinating because you can't talk about the history of cinema without also talking about the history of pornography. They kind of run head to head with each other. But I'm kind of in the same boat where I find them fascinating. But I've not yet found one that has truly just changed my perception yet on the genre. But I love that there's an audience for it. I love that you guys were putting them out and you were essentially feeding that need that people had to see these films. Because let's be real too, if it wasn't for companies like Severin or some of the other boutique labels that dabbled in them, some of these films would probably be lost because there's not many people putting this type of stuff out.
Yeah, that's right. And like I say, they still do well. They still appeal to an audience beyond the Severin hardcore audience as well, because believe it or not, in this day and age where you can get hardcore porn at the click of a button for free, there is still quite a lot of people who actually like well-made softcore, and so that's it's amazing to me that there isn't a digital platform that specializes in softcore, because whenever we've managed to sneak a softcore film up on Amazon before it gets taken down, it always performs well. It's almost like how people used to talk about Playboy. It's a gentleman's magazine. It's got articles in it, so it's basically something where it's like, okay, I'm not going to basically traumatize my children if they come across my copy of Playboy. Now, the same can't be said for some of those Black Emmanuel films. So that's a pretty blanket generalization that I've just given you. But I mean, I do think that there was an art form to making that kind of erotic film.
Oh yeah, and funny enough, I always really appreciated when those elements would find their way into other films. Like, so, growing up, I feel like the low budget erotic thriller was very popular on late night HBO and Cinemax and things like
because
that.
they've been trying to titillate since
Yeah.
the beginning of cinema. I mean, there's ways to do that, but I think the real game changer was Emmanuel, when
Mhm.
Zhuxiakan's Emmanuel came out, when people realized that there was actual blockbuster potential for these
Mhm.
movies. I mean, people often talk about Deep Throat in that respect,
Mhm.
because that led to kind of the commercialization of hardcore. But softcore was something that played in normal cinemas. Emmanuel played in regular cinemas, all over the world, and was seen by couples all over the world, and was not considered something that was like that was going to be too confrontational for adults to see, you know. And I think just the fact that Zhu Shekan died a couple of years ago and it didn't even get a mention in Variety is just pathetic, honestly,
Mhm.
because he absolutely made like one of the most influential movies in the history of cinema. And I said this to I was having lunch with Studio Canal, who licenses quite a lot of films, and I was talking about Zhu Shekan because we've done Gwendolyn and we're working on Emmanuel, the original, and basically I was like, I'd go as far as to say that Zhu Shekan basically made the most important French film in the history of cinema, in terms of how influential and what it spawned afterwards. And of course, they're like thinking Goddard and all that kind of thing. I'm like, well, I don't know. I mean, yes, you could talk about, the editing and the style of Breathless in a certain way, but I don't know that you could find that direct correlation that you can from Emmanuel through hundreds of movies that came out afterwards.
Yeah, like they're
And I was being slightly facetious when I said that, because they were like, ooh la la, like, how could you possibly say that? But Emmanuel was their movie, so I was giving them a compliment.
and I feel like you, even though you're being a little facetious, there's some truth behind it. Even before I had seen any of the Emmanuel films, I was familiar with them. I knew about Emmanuel before I knew about Jean-Luc Godard.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just because of the type of movies I watched. I don't know. I'm sure there's something to that. That's more of a me thing. But
Well, or if you ask just the average person, maybe not anymore, but certainly in the 70s and the 80s and probably the 90s, if you told somebody you were getting an Emmanuel film, they knew exactly what you were talking about.
my dad knew what they were.
If you talked about Jean-Luc Godard or Breathless, I'm not sure
Mhm.
every person in every corner of the country would know what you meant.
Yeah, like my dad, who grew up in a small southern town in Virginia. He grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, a town of 150 people. I was looking at some horror magazine, and they were talking about Emmanuel, and I asked if he knew what it was, and he kind of like smirked to himself and said, "You shouldn't watch those." So that's all he said, but he knew what they were.
Yeah, and it just became a genre in and of itself, in the way that so many movies came out afterwards with just a woman's name in the title,
Mm-hmm.
like Emily or Felicity or Laura or Vanessa, like all of these ones, and they used the same font that was on the poster. They often had the peacock chair in the film somewhere. There were so many small elements that just said, this is that kind of movie.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, like I said, I've been collecting the Severin films for a while now, and I've even been doing some reviews for you guys, which I always really appreciate. And one thing I have to like, I've always appreciated that it seems like with the Severin line, I like that. It feels like you take chances at times. You experiment with different things, different releases. I've always been curious, how did Overboard come to be?
Yeah, I often get asked this, actually. So it's a story I've told
and
quite a
and
bit,
don't get
but
me wrong,
it's
I love Overboard, but it seems like a strange choice.
yeah. Well, basically, I was with some friends one weekend, and we were drinking wine, and one of the friends said that Overboard is her favorite movie. And then I started talking about how, the subtext of that movie is actually a little, I don't know that you could do it today. I mean, it's not that far off from The Sinful Dwarf,
No.
And so basically I said, I mean, it is, but it's like you could make an argument that they are in the same subgenre. And so basically we start to have a laugh about how, wouldn't it be funny if Severin released Overboard? And it just so happened that a colleague of mine was putting in an offer to MGM at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I just texted him and said, put in an offer for Overboard. We're doing Severin's Overboard. And I made the offer, and it was kind of a low ball offer, thinking it would never come to anything. And then roll around Monday morning, I've sobered up. And he's like, MGM's accepted the offer. And I went, oh, shit. Okay, I guess we're doing Overboard.
It's when I saw it, I had to check what day of the week it was. I had to make sure it wasn't like an April Fool's joke, because to my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm no expert when it comes to Severin, I don't think you've released anything like that before.
No, but we'd released things like The Hairdresser's Husband,
Mm-hmm.
and we released a Mike Leigh movie. We've released, we released a couple of Patrice Lecomte movies, actually. So we've released kind of art house movies, but we certainly haven't released anything that was that mainstream that mainstream fare. But that was also part of my argument, is like that basically if you can have a story like that of gaslighting and abuse essentially be in the mainstream and be accepted as something that's wholesome entertainment for all the family, surely that's more dangerous to the fabric of America than the Sinful Dwarf, which you know exactly what it is going in.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to be tricked into thinking that the subtext of that film is totally wholesome.
No, absolutely. And so Overboard is one of those movies that just growing up was on all the time. I feel like it came on television all the time. My mom was a big Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn fan, but it was seen as an adult, and I was like, oh wow, this movie is really abusey.
Yeah, yeah, it
It's
is. It's like it's amazing they got away with it. But you know, a lot of the films in the 80s, you know, you can look at the way that they are such disgusting flag waving propaganda
mhm.
that I find that way more effective. And I used to argue that when I was at film school to anybody who fucking listened, that I was basically like that. You know, this is way more dangerous than a Friday the 13th movie or a slasher movie, because at least with the slasher movie, it does what it says on the box. It is not indoctrinating you into an ideology, which a lot of mainstream Hollywood movies were doing and still do.
No, absolutely. And I feel like I had a similar argument with someone when I was in film school, because I was one of the few people in film school who was a big horror fan, and I was arguing with someone that I thought I don't remember which film I was arguing against, but I think it was an Argento film. But I was saying how 16 Candles is has more grotesque it has more grotesque themes in it than an Argento film. Or actually no, it was a Fulci film. I remember that now.
Yeah.
And
There you go. 16 Candles versus New York Ripper.
yeah,
It's basically, at least New York Ripper's called New York Ripper. You know,
New
it's
York
not,
Ripper
you're
knows
not,
what it is. It's not
you're not
trying to
siding
be.
with the killer in that, but you're siding with Anthony Michael Hall and his date rape.
Yeah.
Same with Revenge of the Nerds, you know?
Yeah, I'm like rewatching Revenge of the Nerds. I was like,
Like,
why does
oh,
this movie make me
shit.
so uncomfortable?
Yeah.
But yet, like I said, New York Ripper, I signed up for New York Ripper. I knew what I was getting myself into. But so yeah, that's absolutely a good way to view it. So like I said, there's been uh, just things throughout this Severin catalog that I really appreciate. Like I said, I love that you released the Changeling. I love that you released. I love that you released Drowning by Numbers. I love that
Drowning by Numbers,
you
yeah.
sneak these. Well, I've always made the argument that I think there's a very fine line between exploitation and art house anyways, but I love that you've been putting out these more art house films as well, or something like Blood for Dracula, which is like a
Yeah.
perfect
Yeah, well, I mean, Blood
foot
for
in
Dracula
both.
definitely falls into the Severin.
Yeah,
Uh,
that one definitely does.
yeah, but and a couple more that we released kind of early on were the Wild Geese and Zulu Dawn, where
Mhm.
the Severin hardcore, like, what the hell are these doing in your catalog, you know? But they are two of the, if not the two most successful titles we've had. So basically, it's like, you know, some of having Zulu Dawn and Wild Geese in there has definitely paid for some of the more wacky choices that we've made over the years.
But I think that's also great because I think at the point that you're putting these things, well, some of those were from early on, but
Yeah.
I love that because for someone who knows the Severin brand, for you to put your stamp of approval on something like a Drowning by Numbers, people are like, okay, I've never heard of this film. It's not normally the type of film I'd want to watch, but I like other things that Severin puts out. Maybe I'll give this a try. And
Yeah,
I think
and
that's a smart
I
way to
think
do
with
it.
Drowning by Numbers in particular, I was like, that's the perfect example of what you're talking about, where it's like the bridge between art house and exploitation. Because I loved Peter Greenaway movies when I was after I saw Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover in my late teens, and was just like, this But what I loved about it was sitting in the movie theater and seeing all these normal people just running out of the theater in disgust. So it was the same kind of visceral reaction that you expect if these people were in seeing the New York Ripper, and basically there they were seeing that. And I loved that amalgamation of beauty and the grotesque, so basically, it's one of the most stunning looking films ever made, yes, and stylistically and everything. It's just an absolutely fantastic film, but it's full of all these grotesqueries that are way too much for the average viewer, and particularly for kind of the viewer that doesn't get out to see many films like with elements like that in them. So to me that was like, that was just, this Greenaway guy's got something going on. And Drowning by Numbers is similar. It's got some shocking moments in it, and it's got a lot of death and nudity and humor. So it has elements that do definitely fit into to Severin fans, to what they like. But yeah, I was very glad to get that. And but there are some that we really kind of go out of the comfort zone, like the Mike Leigh movie All or Nothing just doesn't have anything that would appeal to the average Severin viewer. But it's a fantastic film, and that's kind of what that's kind of the bottom line at the end of the day. Is like, if one of us really champions this movie, then then you can make an argument for us doing a special edition.
No, that makes complete sense. So I want to start wrapping up here because I feel like I've taken a lot of your time, so I really appreciate it. But I was curious, do you have a favorite release? I know it's hard to pick because you're kind of having to choose like between your children, but do you
Yeah.
have a favorite or a couple favorite releases that you're particularly proud of?
Well, Santa Sangre is definitely up there, because I think that's probably probably my favorite of the films that we have in the library. Threads is another. Threads, I think, is just an incredible film for so many different reasons, and I'm very proud to have that on the line. Hell of the Living Dead is another, because that's one that was very important for me when I was growing up, and was as another one of those that's got a bad rap, like a lot of Bruno Mattei, Fragasso, Drudy films did over the years. People, genre fans, just roll their eyes at their work, but I'd like to think that we've now got them to a point where people actually appreciate them for what they are, and not in a kind of let's laugh at them, Ed Wood's the worst filmmaker of all time kind of way. It's like these people were setting out to make these kinds of films. This isn't them being bad filmmakers. This is them doing everything they could with the budget that they had, and they pulled it off. I mean, they made very entertaining movies, and Hell of the Living Dead is one of them. I really like the Scala disc that we just put out, because the Scala was a very important film place for me, seeing stuff in England. But we also got to do the Splatterfest featurette, which was about a specific event that happened at the Scala. So we did our own feature documentary about a night at the Scala. But there are so many. I mean, that Four Flies on Grey Velvet, the fact that that was always the hardest to get of the Argento films, when I was a video collector. The same thing can be said for Dario Argento's Deep Cuts. It's basically, if that was on a VHS tape when I was a teenager, that tape I would have bought and I would have cherished, because it's got all the kind of B-sides on there that you can't get anywhere else. So, but yeah, I mean, most of the stuff we release, I'm into in one way or another.
Yeah. So, and while this show doesn't have the largest net, whenever I do have someone on from a label, like I just recently had someone on from Film Masters, I always like to give an opportunity. Is there something from the Severin catalog that you want to suggest people give a try? So maybe something that didn't sell super well, but you think there's something there. Is there a title that you want to try to move a couple more units on that you think people should give a chance to?
Well, I'd go back to Scala and maybe Drowning by Numbers as well. Although Drowning by Numbers sold very well, I'm not sure it sold very well to our audience. And I think our audience should give it a try and would enjoy it. I mean, it's a very special film, beautiful film.
Okay. And then the last question I have for you before we wrap up: tell us about what people can expect from Severin and from you coming up.
Well, let's see. What have we just? When is this coming out?
This will probably be coming out within the next couple weeks.
Okay, so the later by then we should have announced the next lot of titles, which would be Doctor Who and the Daleks, Daleks Invasion Earth 2050,
Ooh.
The Unknown World, and the 4K of Jack the Ripper, the 1960 British one. So those are the next announcements, and then the last lot was a House of Psychotic Women Volume 2 and Entertaining Mr. Sloan, and
Yeah,
in My Skin is one that I really recommend that people try out. That's a relatively recent film for us, being from the 21st century, but my God, that's a film that I hadn't even heard of when Kayla Janice brought it to us, and when I watched it, I was like, this is a film, this is a movie that people need to see. You know, as
Yes.
far as, you know, the French extreme movement that happened in the early 2000s, this one's the real deal. This isn't some people just coming up with splattery ideas. This is a film that's genuinely disturbing and moving. So we have those. But yeah, the best thing to do is just follow the Severin Films socials, either on Instagram or Facebook, because that's where all the new information drops. That's where sale information goes. And then, of course, every year we have a mid-year sale on July the 4th weekend, and then the Black Friday sale as well, which is where we just drop a ton of new shit.
Yeah, and it looks like there's a sale currently going on the Severin website. I don't know if it'll still be going on by the time this episode goes up, but I do see that that first House of Psychotic Women box set is on sale, so I'm probably going to have to jump on that while I can.
Yeah, so that's it. So because we released Volume 2, you can get Volume 1 cheap now.
Yeah. Alrighty, and then what was the? You said you're working on a new documentary. Is there anything you can talk about yet, or?
We have 3 documentaries that will probably be finished this year, but I can't really say any
Not
more
a problem
at this point because they're not announced.
Fair enough.
But yeah, there's three that should be finished this year. We've probably got 5 or 6 feature documentaries in production in one phase or another, but 3 that should be finished this year.
All right, well, that's something to look forward to. If you want to keep up with Severin Films, make sure you follow them on social media. Favorite their website, because it's always there's always some great stuff on there. And I really appreciate you giving some time to me today, David, and talking about our mutual love for film and Severin and everything in between.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you having me on.
Alrighty. And if you, at this point, everyone who's listening to the show should know where to find me. I'm Michael_Viers on pretty much every form of social media. You can find me, I do physical media reviews at Shameless Picture Show. I talk about aspect ratios probably more than anyone on TikTok does, which is kind of my niche now at this point. Yeah, thanks everyone for listening. Make sure you check out the Severin website, and we'll see you next time. Shame Plays, Shameless Picture Show.
The Shameless Picture Show is a proud member of the Cinepunks Podcast Network. The show is recorded in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and is hosted and produced by Michael Viers. The show is created by Michael Viers and Nick Richards. The Shameless Picture Show is edited by Austin Proctor of the Frightmares Podcast. Amanda Viers is the show's graphic designer and a big help behind the scenes. Our theme music was composed by Austin Proctor with narration by Nick Richards. The end credit music you're currently enjoying was generously provided to us by the band 10 Speed. And an extra special thank you to all our Patreon supporters and to our generous sponsors. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, iHeartRadio, and directly at Cinepunks.com.